My name is Alden Voss, and for 23 years I stood close enough to King Alaric and Queen Consort Morwenna to hear them breathe. I want to say that first, before anything else, because everything I am about to tell you happened within arm's reach of two people the world thinks it already understands. It does not. I promise you that. The night I decided to finally speak came at a state dinner in the long gallery at the palace at Harrowgate, 4 months before my retirement, when a foreign minister's aide, 3 glasses of Eldermoor red into the evening, leaned toward a colleague and said, loud enough for me to hear over the string quartet, that the king had married the scandal who won. He said it with a smile, the way clever people say cruel things when they think no one who matters is listening. I was not supposed to be listening. I was a wall. I was a red coat and a rifle and a face that did not move. That is the job, and I did the job, and I did not so much as blink. But something in me went very still and very cold, the particular stillness of a man who knows a lie when he hears one spoken as fact, and who cannot say a single word to correct it. I have stood guard through worse insults than that: drunken tourists, entitled dignitaries, men who thought a red tunic meant a target. Those never touched me. This one did because I knew better. I had watched King Alaric hold Queen Morwenna's hand under a table during the worst night of his life, when no camera in the world could see it. I had watched her sit up until 4 in the morning outside a hospital corridor because she would not let him grieve alone, and I had watched him do the same for her, years earlier, when the whole kingdom had turned against her, and she had nowhere else left to stand. I knew better than that aide, better than most of the newspapers that have made careers out of guessing at the private lives of people I actually served, what kind of marriage that was. I'm not going to give you scandal tonight. I want to say that plainly, because scandal is what people expect when a former royal guard finally opens his mouth about the 2 people he spent 2 decades protecting. There is none here. What I have instead is smaller and, I think, better. A collection of true, ordinary, unglamorous moments that I watched happen when neither of them thought anyone was watching at all. A marriage built not on the version the tabloids sold you, but on 20 years of small kindnesses so private that even I, standing 3 feet away with a rifle at my shoulder, sometimes felt like I was intruding just by witnessing them. I joined the Royal Guard of Eldermoor at 19, the son of a stonemason from the Western Hill country, who had never been inside a palace gate in his life, until the day I marched through one in a uniform that did not yet fit me. I trained for 2 years in the outer garrisons before I was ever posted anywhere near the royal family themselves, and when I finally was, it was not glamorous. I stood at a service gate on the north side of Harrowgate for 11 months, checking delivery carts and nodding at the same florist twice a week. I tell you this because I want you to understand that I did not arrive already close to them. I earned my way inward the way every guard does, inch by inch, year by year, through 1,000 quiet demonstrations that I could be trusted to see things and say nothing. By the time I was posted to the inner household detail, the corridor outside the private family apartments, the garden paths only the family and staff use, the small unmarked door through which the king and queen consort slip out when they want 10 minutes that belong to no one but themselves. I was 29 years old, and Alaric was not yet king. He was still crown prince then, a man in his middle years who carried a weight I did not fully understand until much later, and Morwenna was, to most of the kingdom, still the name whispered at the end of every unkind sentence about his first marriage. I will tell you honestly, I believed some of what was whispered too when I first arrived. I had grown up on the same rumors everyone else grew up on. I did not know yet how wrong they were. It took me the better part of 2 years of standing near her, unnoticed, to understand that the woman the newspapers described did not exist, and never had. One of the first cracks in that inherited assumption came early, in my 2nd year on the inner detail, on an ordinary wet evening when I was posted outside a small sitting room where Morwenna was meeting alone with a junior member of the household staff. A young woman who had, I later learned, made a costly error in the arrangements for an upcoming public engagement, and fully expected to be dismissed for it. I could hear enough through the half-open door to know the shape of the conversation without following every word, and I remember bracing myself, the way I imagine most of the household braced themselves in those years, for the cold dressing down the newspapers had trained everyone to expect from her. It never came. I heard her instead ask the young woman calmly what had gone wrong, listen without interrupting, and then spend a good 10 minutes talking through, patiently and without a trace of condescension, how to prevent the same mistake from happening again, before sending the girl off not with a reprimand, but with an assurance that everyone under that roof was permitted to make a mistake now and again, so long as they were honest about it afterward. I remember standing at that door afterward, turning the moment over in my mind for a long while, because it did not fit anything I thought I already knew, and it was the first time in my service that I let myself seriously wonder whether the woman on the other side of that door bore any real resemblance to the woman I had read about for years before I ever wore this uniform. I want to tell you how they actually found each other, because it is not the story you have heard, and because I think you cannot understand anything else I am about to tell you without it. They were young together first, long before either of them was who they became. Alaric's family estate at Thornwick Vale bordered the smaller Rosemere estate where Morwenna grew up, the second daughter of a minor but respected line, and the two properties shared a stretch of river where the young people of both households used to ride in the summers. I have heard him tell the story only twice in my hearing, both times late at night, both times not entirely to me but to the room, the way a man talks when he is remembering rather than performing. He said she was the only person of his own age who ever treated him like a person instead of a title, back when he was a serious, awkward young man more comfortable with horses and old books than with the endless procession of eligible young women his family kept introducing him to. He said she teased him mercilessly about his formality, that she once pushed him fully clothed into the Rosemere mill pond for bowing to her, actually bowing, at a family picnic, and that it was the first time in his life anyone had made him laugh so hard he could not stand up straight. That friendship did not become a courtship then. Duty intervened, as duty does for people born to thrones, and the match his family arranged for him, a young noblewoman named Isolde, gracious and beloved, and by every account I ever heard from people who knew her, genuinely good, went forward as royal marriages did in those years, more a merging of houses and expectations than a love story chosen freely by either party at the start. Alaric and Morwenna's paths diverged. She married elsewhere herself, a match that did not last, and raised her children from it, Cassius and Verena, largely on her own for a difficult stretch of years. I will not pretend to know the private details of, because that was never my business and it still is not. Alaric built a life and a family with Isolde, and by every account I trust, he tried honestly to make that marriage work, and for years it did in its way, and Crown Prince Rowan was born of it, and Alaric loved his son entirely, without qualification, from the first day of his life to this one. What happened between Alaric and Morwenna after that, in the years before I ever wore this uniform, was not an affair conducted behind Isolde's back, whatever the tabloids preferred to imply for the sake of a more exciting headline. I want to be careful and exact here, because it matters, and because I watched both of them, years later, carry the weight of how badly that period of their lives had been misunderstood by the public, and I do not intend to misrepresent it further even in the telling. What I understand, from things said in my hearing over many years by people who lived through it, and had no reason to lie to each other in a private hallway at midnight, is that Alaric and Morwenna's marriage came only after his marriage to Isolde had already ended, after a long separation, after Isolde herself had built a full and separate life of her own. And this is the part few outside the family ever chose to remember. After years in which Alaric and Morwenna kept a respectful distance from each other precisely because they understood how it would look, and how much it would hurt people if they did not. When they did finally come back together, it was slow and careful, and it was years before either of them would be seen anywhere near the other in public. I know this because by then I was close enough to see the caution myself, a caution that never fully left either of them, even decades later, even after they were married, even after the kingdom had mostly made its peace with it. Some habits of care, once you have hurt people badly enough by accident, never entirely leave you. I tell you all of this not to defend a fairy tale. It was not a fairy tale. It was two flawed, grown, imperfect people who loved each other young, lost each other to duty, lived whole separate lives with all the joy and grief those lives contained, and then, older and more careful than they had been at 20, found their way back to each other and built something neither of them had expected to have twice. That is not scandal. That is just what it looks like when two people are honest, late, about something they should perhaps have said earlier, and spend the rest of their lives being gentle with each other because of it. The gentleness is what I actually want to tell you about, not the history you can find distorted in 100 places already, and I am not the man to set every record straight, nor is that my purpose here. What I can give you, because I was there for it and almost no one else was, is the small daily architecture of a marriage that the public was never permitted to see, because neither Alaric nor Morwenna would have dreamed of putting it on display. They were not performers. That more than anything is what the world has always misunderstood about them, that their reticence, the coolness people read off a handful of photographs taken from 200 yards away through a long lens, was never coldness between the two of them. It was privacy. It was two people who had already lost their privacy once, disastrously, and had decided, quietly and without ever discussing it where I could hear, that whatever else the world took from them, it would not get to watch them love each other. I stood outside that privacy for years, before I ever got a real look inside it. What changed things for me was a rainy Tuesday in autumn, my 4th year on the inner detail, when I was posted to the small covered walk between the private apartments and the east garden. A walk almost no one uses, low-ceilinged, unremarkable, the kind of post a guard draws when there is genuinely nothing expected to happen. Nothing was expected to happen that morning either. And then the door from the private apartments opened 40 minutes before the king's first scheduled appointment, and King Alaric came out in a plain gray coat with no attendants, no secretary, nothing on his face for the cameras because there were no cameras, and Queen Consort Morwenna came out a moment behind him in a coat that did not match anything she would ever have worn in public, and the two of them walked past me without seeing me at all, down toward the low stone bench at the end of the walk, and sat down together in the rain. They did not say very much. That is the thing I remember most clearly, all these years later, how little they actually said. He took her gloved hand in both of his. She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that for perhaps 6 or 7 minutes, not speaking, while the rain came down steadily on the garden hedges in front of them, and I stood at my post 20 feet away, invisible to them in the way good guards learn to be invisible, watching two of the most photographed people in the kingdom do absolutely nothing newsworthy at all. Then he said something too quiet for me to catch, and she laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, the kind that startles out of a person, and he smiled the way I had never once seen him smile in an official portrait, and they got up and went back inside, and 40 minutes later he was standing in the throne room in full formal dress, receiving a trade delegation from the eastern provinces with a face of perfect, practiced composure. And nothing in his bearing gave away that he had spent the last hour of his morning sitting in the rain, holding his wife's hand, and being made to laugh like a boy. I did not understand, that first morning, that I had just witnessed something they did nearly every single day of their married life. I thought it was an aberration, a strange private grief working itself out in an unguarded hour. It took me another year of quiet postings near that walk, and near the small door, and near the private garden, before I understood that the rain bench was a ritual, not an accident. That whatever the weather, whatever the schedule, whatever crisis was unfolding elsewhere in the kingdom that particular week, the king and queen consort found some version of those 6 or 7 minutes together nearly every morning before the public day began. Sometimes it was the bench. Sometimes, in bad weather, it was a window seat in the small breakfast room that faced east, where I would see them through the glass from my post in the corridor, sitting knee to knee with 2 cups of tea between them, not always talking, sometimes just present in the same silence. I came to think of it privately as the only part of their day that belonged entirely to them and to no one else, not to the kingdom, not to the household, not even, in a sense, to their own children, who had their own claims on both of them and who I know were loved without any qualification whatsoever, but who were not part of that particular quiet hour. It was theirs alone. I do not believe either of them ever spoke of it to anyone outside that little walk and that little window seat. I certainly never heard it discussed by household staff, who would have gossiped about anything else in the palace without a second thought. I think, in fact, that I may be one of only a handful of people alive who knows the ritual existed at all, and I have kept it to myself for 2 decades because it was not mine to give away. I am giving it to you now, at the end of my service, because I think the world owes them something it has never offered, not sympathy. They would neither want nor need that, but simply accuracy. I watched a real marriage happen in the gaps between official engagements, in 6-minute increments on a rain-wet stone bench, in 100 small unrecorded gestures that no biographer will ever document because no biographer was standing where I was standing. That is what I intend to tell you, not the parts of their story that made headlines, the parts that never did because they were never meant to. The tea is a small thing, and I hesitate to spend words on it, except that it taught me more about the shape of their marriage than almost anything grander I ever witnessed. Queen Morwenna does not sleep well. I do not think this is any great secret within the household, though it has never once been reported outside it, and I only came to understand the extent of it, because I stood so many overnight postings outside the family apartments over the years that I eventually learned the sound of her door opening at 2 or 3 in the morning the way I learned the sound of my own front gate at home. She does not cry out, does not call for anyone, has never once in my hearing made a scene of it. She simply cannot sleep some nights, and on those nights she gets up quietly and goes to sit in the small sitting room off the bedroom, and more often than not, within a few minutes, King Alaric gets up too. He never asked her what was wrong, not in the years I observed this, not that I ever overheard. I think, honestly, he did not need to ask, because he already knew, in the way people who have loved each other a long time come to know the weather inside another person without being told. What he did instead, nearly every time, was make her tea himself, not summon a servant to do it, though servants were awake and available at every hour of the night in that household, and it would have taken him a call bell and 30 seconds to have it brought, but walk down to the small pantry off the private kitchen himself, in his dressing gown, at 3 in the morning, and make it exactly the way she liked it. Which I am told by a member of the kitchen staff who noticed the pattern long before I ever did, is not the way most people take their tea at all. Heavy on the bergamot, more sugar than any physician would recommend, and always poured into the same chipped blue cup that by any sensible accounting should have been retired to a cupboard years before I ever arrived at the palace. I asked once, very carefully, of an older steward who had served the household even longer than I had, why that particular cup was never replaced, given that the family had cupboards full of porcelain fine enough to set a state table. He told me, and I have no reason to doubt him, because he had nothing to gain from inventing it, that the cup had belonged to Morwenna's grandmother, that it was one of the only things she had kept from a difficult stretch of her own childhood, and that King Alaric had noticed, very early in their years together, that she reached for it without thinking whenever she was unsettled, the way a person reaches for a familiar coat on a cold day without deciding to. He said the king had quietly instructed the kitchen staff, decades before I ever arrived, that the blue cup was never, under any circumstances, to be packed away, chipped or not, and that if it ever broke beyond use, he wanted to be told immediately and personally, because he intended to have it mended himself rather than have it thrown away. I do not know how many nights, over 23 years, I stood at my post and heard the small domestic sounds of a king making tea for his wife in the dark because she could not sleep. I stopped counting somewhere in my second decade of service. What I can tell you is that I never once, not one single time in all those years, heard him sound impatient about it, never heard him sigh the particular sigh of a man doing an unwelcome chore, never heard so much as a clipped word pass between them on those nights. I heard, instead, low conversation, sometimes laughter, sometimes long silences broken only by the sound of a spoon against porcelain, and always, eventually, the sound of the two of them going back to bed together sometime before dawn, so that by the time either of them appeared in public later that same day, nothing in their bearing would have told you that either of them had lost a single hour of sleep. There is a book, too, that I should tell you about, because it sat on the small table beside that same sitting room window for the entire span of my service, and I watched it change hands between them so many times that I came to think of it less as a book and more as a kind of running conversation neither of them ever seemed to finish. It was a battered, unremarkable volume of old Eldermoor folk poetry, the kind of book you might find in any second-hand shop in the capital, not valuable, not rare, its spine cracked and re-glued at least once that I noticed. I never read a page of it myself, of course. It was not my business, and I would not have presumed, but I could not help noticing over the years, standing near enough to that table on so many long nights, that the book was always full of small paper markers, and that from time to time I would see one of them pick it up, read for a moment, and then take a pencil from the little dish beside it and write something small in the margin before setting it back down. I asked about it only once, very late in my service, and only because Queen Morwenna herself brought it up unprompted, which surprised me enough that I have never forgotten the conversation. She had caught me glancing at the book. I did not think I had, but she noticed things most people missed, a habit I came to respect enormously over the years. And she said, with a small private smile that had nothing performed about it at all, that she and the king had been leaving each other notes in that book for longer than either of them cared to admit, that it had started as a joke early in their marriage when he underlined a line of verse he thought described her exactly and left it for her to find, and that neither of them had ever quite been able to stop. She said some of what was written in those margins was foolish, some of it was old arguments long since resolved, and some of it, she said, looking not at me but out the window toward the garden, was things neither of them had ever managed to say out loud, even to each other, even after all these years, except in pencil, in the margins of a book that would mean nothing to anyone else who ever picked it up. I think of that book often, now that my service has ended. I think it is, in its way, the truest thing I can tell you about their marriage, that it was built, in large part, in the unglamorous margins of ordinary life, in tea made at 3 in the morning and pencil notes in a cheap old book, and that none of it was ever meant for anyone but the two of them. Their marriage was not only made of quiet mornings and private tenderness, and I do not want to give you the impression that it came easily to everyone around them, because it did not, and the hardest part of it for a long stretch of years was Crown Prince Rowan. I understood this from the beginning in a way I think few outside the immediate household ever did, because I drew postings near both of them often enough to watch the relationship in something closer to real time than the newspapers ever managed. Rowan was a young man when his father remarried, old enough to have his own memories of his mother, old enough to have formed his own private loyalties, and I do not think anyone with a heart in his chest could have expected him to welcome Morwenna easily, whatever the truth of the years before his father's second marriage actually was. He was never cruel to her, not in my hearing, not once. Rowan was raised too well and loved his father too plainly for that, but for a long time, years, he was correct with her in the particular, careful way people are correct with someone they have not yet decided to trust. Polite, formal, a little distant. I watched her absorb that distance without ever once, in my hearing, complaining of it to the king, without ever pressing Rowan for more warmth than he was ready to give, without ever competing, even implicitly, with the memory of the boy's mother. What she did instead, over years, not weeks, was smaller and slower than anyone watching from outside could have appreciated. She learned, I am told by staff who worked more closely with the young prince's household than I did, that Rowan had inherited his mother's love of a particular strain of pale climbing rose that had grown along the south wall of Isolde's own girlhood home, and that after Isolde's passing, the plantings at Harrowgate had never quite included it, an absence no one had ever thought to remedy, because no one had thought of it at all except, eventually, Morwenna. I was on duty in the south garden the morning the new rose beds were unveiled, a small, unannounced planting, nothing formal, no ceremony, just gardeners at dawn and a note left for Rowan to find on his own, unsigned, that simply read that his mother's roses had come home. I watched him find that note. I watched him stand very still over it for a long moment, the way a man stands still when he is deciding whether he is about to cry in front of a guard he does not know is watching, and then I watched him fold it very carefully and put it in his coat, and I never once heard him mention it to anyone, and I never once saw Morwenna mention it either, in all the years afterward, not even, so far as I know, to the king himself. That was not the moment their relationship changed. Nothing so tidy as a single moment ever is, in my experience, when it comes to real people healing real wounds. But I marked it privately as the beginning of something, and over the following years I watched Rowan's formality with her soften by degrees so gradual that I could only really see the change by comparing how he was with her at the start of my service to how he was with her by the end of it. By the time Rowan had his own family, his own children running through the Harrowgate gardens, I watched him seek her out for advice the way a son seeks out a mother, watched him laugh with her, genuinely, at family dinners I was posted to guard, watched him, on more than one occasion I will not forget, defend her without hesitation when someone outside the family made an unkind remark in his hearing, the particular fierce loyalty of a man who has decided, finally and completely, where he stands. I do not think that loyalty was given to her because of any single grand gesture. I think it was given to her because she was patient for years in ways almost no one saw, and because King Alaric, for his part, never once forced the issue, never once pressured his son toward an affection he could not yet feel, and simply trusted that if what he and Morwenna had built together was as real as he believed it to be, Rowan would find his own way to it eventually. He did. It took the better part of a decade. I watched every year of it. The hardest stretch of years I ever witnessed either of them pass through, though, had nothing to do with Rowan at all, and everything to do with the slow decline of Alaric's mother, the late Queen Mother Rosalind, in the final 2 years of her life. I was posted during that period, more often than not to the private wing of the palace nearest her rooms, and I want to tell you plainly that watching a king grieve his mother while still being required, every single day, to appear before his kingdom in full composure, is one of the most quietly brutal things I have ever witnessed a person endure. There is no allowance made in that life for an ordinary son's grief. The engagements do not stop. The ribbons still need cutting. The delegations still need receiving. The ceremonial obligations of the crown do not pause because the man wearing it is losing his mother one difficult month at a time. What I watched during those 2 years was Morwenna quietly absorb an enormous share of that weight, without ever once making it visible to anyone outside the family. She was not, by any account I ever heard, particularly close to Rosalind in the early years of her marriage to Alaric. The two women's relationship had its own complicated history, shaped by everything that had come before, and I do not think either of them would have described themselves as naturally warm toward each other at the start. But I watched that change slowly over the 2 years of Rosalind's decline into something I can only describe as genuine devotion. Morwenna began visiting the Queen Mother's rooms herself, often alone, often in the early afternoon when Alaric was occupied with matters of state and could not go himself, and I was posted outside that door often enough to know it was not a performance for anyone's benefit, because no one but the household staff and I ever knew those visits were happening at all. I asked once carefully of the physician who attended Rosalind in her final months whether he thought those visits mattered to her, and he told me, and he was not a man given to sentiment, so I believed him entirely, that the Queen Mother had said to him near the end that she had misjudged Morwenna badly for many years out of loyalty to a version of events she had never fully examined, and that she was grateful, more grateful than she knew how to say. That Morwenna had never once held that misjudgment against her, not for a single day, and had simply kept showing up anyway. The night Rosalind finally passed, I was on duty in the corridor outside her rooms, along with 2 other guards, and I watched the family gather in the hours before the end in the particular hushed, careful way families gather when everyone in the room knows what is coming, and no one wants to be the one to say it aloud. Alaric sat at his mother's bedside for most of that night, and Rowan came, and Princess Adela, his sister, came, and for a long stretch of hours it was, as it should have been, entirely a family's private grief, with no room in it for anyone else, least of all a guard standing post in a corridor. But I watched Morwenna too that night, and what I remember most clearly is not any single dramatic moment, but the steadiness of her. She was the one who thought to have tea brought for the family at 2 in the morning when no one else had eaten or drunk anything in hours, the one who quietly took Adela's hand when the princess finally broke down somewhere past 3, the one who, when Alaric finally came out of that room some time before dawn, having sat with his mother in her final minutes, did not say a single word to him, did not ask him anything, did not require anything of him at all, but simply stood and opened her arms, and let him come apart in them in the empty corridor for as long as he needed to, with only myself and 1 other guard present to see it. Both of us standing as still and as far into the shadow of the doorway as duty and discretion allowed. I have stood post at a great many difficult moments in my career. I have never forgotten that one. I remember thinking, watching a king who had just lost his mother weep silently against his wife's shoulder in an empty corridor at 5 in the morning, that whatever the newspapers believed about the coldness of that marriage, whatever cruel joke that aide would make years later at a state dinner about a scandal who had merely won something, none of them had ever seen what I was seeing, and none of them ever would. And that the gap between what the world believed and what was actually true had never felt wider to me than it did in that corridor. There is one more thing from that period I feel I should tell you, because it says something about the particular shape of the grief they carried together that I think matters. Every year, on the anniversary of Isolde's own passing years before, Rowan's mother, the king's first wife, I noticed over time that Morwenna would quietly arrange for flowers to be sent to Rowan's household, always the pale climbing roses from the garden she had restored for him years earlier, always unsigned, though by then everyone in the family understood exactly where they came from, and no explanation was needed. And I noticed, too, that on that same day each year, she would make certain, without ever announcing it or asking to be thanked for it, that Alaric's public schedule was left clear of anything demanding for at least the morning, so that he could have those hours to himself, to grieve a woman who had once been his wife and who had given him his son, without the crown's obligations pressing in on him. I do not believe I ever once heard Alaric ask her to do this. I do not believe it was ever discussed between them in my hearing at all. It simply happened, quietly every single year, the way a person who truly understands another person's grief learns to move around it without being asked, and I came, over the years, to think of that unspoken arrangement, flowers for the son, A clear morning for the husband, no fuss, no announcement, no credit sought, as one of the most genuinely loving things I ever witnessed pass between two people in all my years of service. It is not the kind of love that photographs well. It would never make a headline, but I do not know a truer definition of the word than a woman quietly making room, year after year, for her husband to grieve another woman she never once tried to make him forget. The public turned on her hardest, I should tell you, not in the years right after their marriage, when the worst of the old scandal talk might have been expected, but a good while later, during a stretch when the kingdom's newspapers had run dry of real news and decided, as newspapers sometimes do, to manufacture a controversy out of an old wound that had mostly healed. Someone had unearthed and republished, with a great deal of dramatic framing, some of the ugliest rumors from years before, the affair that had never been an affair, the scandal that had never quite been a scandal, all of it dressed up freshly enough that a new generation of readers who had not lived through the original controversy took it at face value. For a period of some weeks, Morwenna could not appear at a public engagement without a portion of the crowd turning visibly hostile, without placards, without shouted insults that I stood close enough to hear clearly, and that I will not repeat here because they do not deserve repeating. I watched her endure that period with a composure that, at the time, I frankly mistook for coldness, the same mistake so many other people made about her for so many years. It was not until much later, after I had come to know her better, that I understood how much that composure cost her, and how deliberately she maintained it, because she believed, rightly or wrongly, I will let you judge for yourself, that any visible crack in it would only be seized upon as confirmation of everything the worst of the rumors said about her. There was one engagement in particular during that stretch, a charity gala for a children's hospital that had been on her calendar for months, and that she was, by every account I heard from her own household staff, seriously considering canceling, rather than face the hostile crowds that had gathered outside her last several public appearances. I was not posted to her detail that particular evening. I want to be honest about the limits of what I witnessed firsthand, but I heard the story more than once from a fellow guard who was present, a man named Alaric who has since retired himself, and who told it to me over a good many years with enough consistency that I have never doubted a word of it. Alaric told me had no public engagement of his own scheduled that night. He was not expected. He was not on any official program. But when Morwenna's car pulled up outside the hospital gates and the crowd began its ugly noise, the king stepped out of the vehicle first, in full formal dress, having told almost no one of his intention beforehand, and simply walked around to her door and offered her his arm, the way he might have done at any ordinary engagement of his own, and walked her in through that gauntlet of shouted insults at a slow, unhurried, entirely deliberate pace, looking at no one but her the entire way. Fenwick said the crowd's noise did not stop, not entirely, but that it thinned considerably, the way a crowd's ugliness often does when it is forced to look directly at the thing it is being cruel to, and finds a king's steady, unbothered presence standing beside it instead of the isolated woman it had expected to bully. Fenwick said that by the time they reached the hospital doors, Morwenna's hand on the king's arm had stopped shaking, and that neither of them said a single word about it afterward to anyone in the household, that evening or ever, as though it had simply been the ordinary thing a husband does, which I suppose, to the two of them, it was. I think of that story often. I did not witness it myself, and I want to be honest with you about that, but I trust the man who told it to me as much as I trust my own memory, and it fits, exactly, the pattern of 100 smaller things I did witness with my own eyes over 23 years. Alaric was never a man who announced his devotion. He simply, quietly, without fail, showed up. There is a point in every long service where the thing you are guarding stops being an assignment and becomes something you would defend even off duty, without a rifle, without a uniform, simply because you have come to believe in it. For me, that point had a specific date, and I remember it more clearly than I remember most of my own family's birthdays, because it was the year my father, the stonemason I told you about at the start of this account, fell seriously ill back in the Western Hill Country, and I did not know until it happened that anyone in the palace beyond my own immediate superior even knew his name. I had never once mentioned my father to the king or to the queen consort. There was no reason I should have. A guard does not bring his private life into the postings, and I had been careful, over more than a decade of service by then, never to let so much as a flicker of my own troubles show while I stood at my station. But apparently a member of the household staff, a kitchen woman I had known for years and occasionally spoken with about small, ordinary things, had mentioned in passing, in the way household staff mention things to each other, that my father was failing, and that I had been putting in for leave to travel west to see him. Leave that the rota made difficult to grant on short notice given how thinly the inner detail was already stretched that particular season. I did not know any of this had reached beyond the kitchen until Queen Morwenna herself found me at my post one gray Thursday morning. Found me, not summoned me, walked the length of the private corridor herself to where I stood at attention outside the small breakfast room, and asked me quietly, without any fuss at all, how my father was doing. I remember being so startled that I very nearly forgot to answer her properly. I told her he was not well. She asked next whether I had been able to see him. I told her honestly that the rota made it difficult just then, and that I did not wish to trouble my superior for an exception when other men had families of their own waiting on leave as well. She did not say very much more to me in that moment. She thanked me, the way she thanked everyone, with a directness that never felt like performance, and went back inside. I thought, frankly, that the conversation would end there, one kind woman's passing courtesy to a guard she happened to notice looking tired. 3 days later my rota was rearranged, quietly, through channels I never fully traced and never asked about, and I was given 11 days of leave with no explanation offered and none required. And when I arrived at my father's bedside in the Western Hill Country, the physician attending him told me that a sum of money had already been anonymously arranged through the palace almoner's office to cover the full cost of a specialist's care that my family could never, on a guardsman's wage, have afforded on our own. I asked who had arranged it. The physician did not know or would not say. I have never received any confirmation in all the years since of who was responsible, because that is precisely how the household arranges these things when it wishes a kindness to remain anonymous. No note, no acknowledgement expected, nothing that could ever be traced back or thanked properly. But I knew. I want to be honest with you about that. I did not need a signature to know, because I had watched that same quiet, deliberate, unglamorous generosity move through that household for more than a decade by then, always aimed at people who had no way of repaying it, and often no way of even proving where it had come from. My father lived another 11 months after that, longer than the physicians had first expected, and I was able to be with him for the last of it because a woman the newspapers had spent years describing as calculating, and cold had walked down a private corridor on a gray Thursday morning to ask a guard she barely knew how his father was doing, and had then done something about the answer without ever once mentioning it to me again. I did not thank her properly until years afterward, and even then I was clumsy about it, because I did not entirely know how to put it into words without embarrassing us both. She waved it off, the way she waved off nearly everything of that kind, and said only that she remembered what it was to watch a parent decline while feeling powerless to help, and that she had simply done what anyone in her position would have done. I do not believe that is true. I believe most people in her position, with that much power and that many demands on their attention, would never have noticed a tired-looking guard at all, let alone remembered his father's name 3 days later. But she did not want to be thanked for it, and so, until tonight, I have never told this story to anyone outside my own family. I tell it to you now because it is the moment, more than any other in 23 years of service, that settled the question in my own mind for good. I had already, by then, watched enough small private kindnesses pass between Alaric and Morwenna to suspect that the public version of their marriage was wrong. But it was one thing to observe a kindness from a careful distance, standing guard in a corridor, and another thing entirely to have that same kindness turned, unbidden, toward my own father in his final year of life. After that, I was no longer merely a guard who had noticed something interesting about the people he protected. I was a man who owed a debt of loyalty to two people the world had never bothered to understand, and I carried that debt gladly for the rest of my service. It was not long after that year, as it happened, that the two of them faced the hardest public test of their marriage that I witnessed in all my time at Harrowgate. Not a private grief this time, but a public storm, manufactured almost entirely out of nothing, that came closer than anything else I ever saw to genuinely damaging what they had built together. I want to tell you about that now, because I think it is the part of this account where the two of them were tested most severely, and because, to my great and lasting regret, I played a small part in how it began. It happened at a retired guardsmen's dinner, of all unremarkable places, an annual gathering held in a hired hall in the capital where old colleagues who had long since left service gathered once a year to eat too much, drink a little more than they should, and tell stories about the postings they no longer had to keep quiet about because the men and women they had guarded had long since moved on or passed on themselves. I was still serving that year, still bound fully by my oath, and I should have known better than to let the warmth of the evening loosen my tongue, even by the small margin that it did. But my father had been gone 8 months by then, and someone at the table asked kindly how his final year had gone, and I found myself telling the story of the blue-chipped cup. Not the tea ritual in full, not anything I understood at the time to be truly private, but a small, admiring anecdote about a king who kept an old cracked teacup in service for decades because his wife loved it, offered as nothing more than a fond little proof that the man I served was gentler than his public bearing ever let on. It was a harmless thing to say, I believed at the time, and I still believe I meant no harm by it. But a retired guardsman's dinner is not a sealed room, whatever comfortable illusion of privacy the warmth of old friendship creates, and among the men at that table was a fellow I did not know well, a former guard who had left service some years before under circumstances I never fully learned, whose sister-in-law, it turned out, wrote for one of the capital's less scrupulous papers. I do not know exactly how the detail traveled from that dinner table to her desk. I never asked, and by the time I understood what had happened, it would not have mattered. What I know is that some 6 weeks later, a story ran under a lurid headline claiming that palace insiders had revealed the Queen Consort suffered from severe, ongoing sleeplessness that left her distraught and inconsolable in the small hours of the morning, that the king was regularly seen slipping away from the marital bed to attend to her in what the article's anonymous source characterized, with a great deal of insinuation and almost no actual fact, as evidence of a marriage under real and mounting strain. I want you to understand how thoroughly and how cruelly that story inverted the truth. The tea, the chipped blue cup, the low conversation and the occasional laughter I had listened to from my post so many nights over so many years, all of it, the very proof of a marriage's quiet tenderness, had been taken by someone who had never once witnessed it directly and refashioned, through nothing more than a stranger's cynical imagination, into evidence of the exact opposite. I recognized my own careless words in the shape of that article the moment I read it, recognized the cup, recognized the hour, recognized the details closely enough that I felt something go cold and sick in my stomach that has never fully left me even now, years later, telling you this. For a short while I believed, I hoped, desperately, that the story would simply be dismissed as the unsourced tabloid speculation it largely was. The palace press office issued a brief, calm denial within a day, as it always did with stories of that kind, and for perhaps a week I let myself believe the matter had passed, the way most such stories eventually do, forgotten within a news cycle or two by a public with a great many other things to occupy its attention. That was the false dawn, and I clung to it harder than I should have, because I wanted very badly to believe that my own small indiscretion had not truly cost anyone anything. It had. Within that same week, a second, larger paper, one with a wider readership and a columnist known across the kingdom for exactly this kind of speculative cruelty, picked up the story and expanded it, adding fabricated additional sources that I am certain never existed, reviving in the same breath every old rumor from the era before their marriage, the scandal who won, the affair that was never an affair. All of it dragged back into the light and stitched together into a single sweeping narrative that the columnist framed, with a straight face, as the long-overdue unmasking of a marriage that had never been anything more than two calculating people, managing a shared image for the sake of the crown. Other outlets followed within days, each adding its own embellishment, each treating the previous outlet's speculation as though it were established fact simply because it had already been printed once. By the end of that second week, the crowds outside Morwenna's public engagements had turned hostile again, in a way I had genuinely believed, after so many good years, we had left behind for good. I stood post at two of those engagements myself and heard, with my own ears, insults shouted at a woman who had spent a decade of anonymous, unglamorous kindness earning nothing but this in return. I carried the guilt of that period like a stone in my chest, and I did not know, for the better part of a month, what I ought to do about it. I told myself, at first, that confessing my part would change nothing, would only add another name to a scandal that had already grown far larger than any single indiscretion of mine, and would very likely cost me my career, and perhaps my pension after more than a decade of otherwise unblemished service. I am not proud of how long I let that reasoning hold me silent. I watched Alaric's face grow visibly more strained across those weeks, watched Morwenna's public composure stretch thinner and thinner, watched Rowan step forward more than once in her defense with a fierce loyalty that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, how much the family had come to value her, and how much this manufactured storm was genuinely wounding them. And still I said nothing, because I was afraid. And because some cowardly part of me kept hoping the whole business would simply blow itself out before anyone traced it back to a dinner table and a careless story about a teacup. It did not blow itself out. If anything, it grew worse, because a story that has been allowed to sit unanswered for a month gathers a kind of false authority simply through repetition. And by the time the 6th week arrived, I understood, with a clarity that finally shamed me into action, that my silence was not protecting anyone. It was only protecting me, at the direct cost of two people who had shown my own family more kindness than I had any right to expect, and who deserved, at the very least, to know the truth of where the wound had actually come from. I asked for a private audience, which was not a thing a guard of my rank did lightly or often, and it was granted the following evening, in the small sitting room off the family apartments where I had stood post so many times over so many years, without ever once being invited to sit down inside it myself. I told them everything, the dinner, the cup, the careless story told to men I had trusted without ever truly knowing them, the guardsman whose sister-in-law wrote for the paper that had started it all. I told them I understood if this cost me my position, and that I would not contest whatever consequence they judged appropriate, because I had, however unintentionally, broken the single most basic obligation of my service, which was to protect their privacy as completely as I protected their persons. I remember the silence that followed longer than I remember almost anything else from those 23 years. Alaric did not speak first. He looked, for a long moment, not angry but simply tired, the particular tiredness of a man who has spent 6 weeks absorbing blows he could not answer and has just been handed, at last, an explanation for where one of them had come from. And then Morwenna spoke, and what she said has stayed with me every day since. She said that she had spent a great deal of her life being defined by other people's careless words, by rumors she had never authorized, by a public narrative built largely out of speculation and old grievance rather than fact, and that she understood, better than almost anyone in that palace, how easily a small true thing could be twisted by a stranger with no stake in the truth of it into something cruel and false. She said she did not believe I had told that story with any intention of harming her, and that she had watched me, over more than a decade, prove myself a man of genuine loyalty in 100 small ways that mattered far more to her than one careless evening at a dinner table. She said, and I have never forgotten the exact phrase, that she was not in the business of destroying good men over a single mistake made out of love rather than malice, because if she were, she would have very few good men left around her at all. I did not lose my position that night. I offered, again, to resign, and Alaric told me, with a directness that startled me, that he needed men who understood the weight of discretion precisely, because they had once failed to carry it well enough, more than he needed men who had never been tested at all. What they asked of me instead, and what I gave gladly for the remainder of my service, was simply this: continued silence about everything I had not yet told anyone, and patience, because they did not intend to answer the manufactured scandal with a counter-scandal of their own, or with a public relations campaign, or with anything that would dignify the false story by engaging with it directly. They intended, instead, to do what they had always done, which was to keep quietly being who they actually were, and to trust, as they had trusted for 20 years already, that the truth of a life lived with integrity eventually outlasts the noise made against it. I did not fully believe, in the weeks that followed, that patience alone would be enough to turn a storm that large. I had watched it grow for 6 weeks by the time I confessed, and I expected, honestly, that it would take months more to fade, if it ever fully did. What actually turned it in the end was not any deliberate strategy at all, but a single unplanned moment that neither of them could have staged even if they had wanted to, which I think is precisely why it worked as completely as it did. There was a scheduled engagement, some 3 weeks after my confession, at a regional hospital in the eastern provinces, a long-planned visit to a new children's ward that neither Alaric nor Morwenna would have dreamed of canceling, whatever storm was raging around them, because the appointment had been made to a group of very sick children who had been looking forward to it for months. I was part of the traveling detail that day, posted near enough to the ward's entrance to see most of what happened, though not close enough, I want to be honest, to hear every word. Partway through the visit, a small boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, gravely ill by every visible sign, reached from his hospital bed not for the king, who stood nearer to him, but for Morwenna, and asked her, in the plain, unguarded way children ask things adults have learned not to, whether the newspapers were right that she made the king sad. I watched her face for the half-second before she answered, and I do not think, in 23 years, I ever saw her more unguarded in public than she was in that instant, caught entirely off script by a dying child's honest question in front of a bank of press cameras that had been let into the ward specifically to photograph exactly this kind of encounter. She did not deflect the question, and she did not perform an answer for the cameras. She sat down on the edge of the boy's bed, took his hand, and told him simply that she loved his king very much, that they had breakfast together every single morning, and that if he did not believe her, he was welcome to ask the king himself, who was standing right there and had never once in his life been able to lie convincingly to a child. Alaric, for his part, came and sat on the boy's other side without any hesitation at all, took the boy's other hand, and told him, with a warmth that no adviser could ever have coached into him, that his wife made him laugh nearly every single day, and that anyone who told him otherwise had clearly never met her. That exchange, unscripted, unplanned, caught on camera only by accident because a photographer happened to have his lens trained on the bed at exactly the wrong, or exactly the right moment, ran in every paper in the kingdom within a day, and it did more to answer 6 weeks of manufactured cruelty than any official statement or press strategy ever could have. I do not think either of them fully understood, in the moment, how much that small, unguarded exchange with a sick child would matter to how the public finally came to see them. I do not think they were thinking about the public at all. I think they were simply doing what they had always done in private for 20 years, except that for once, by pure accident, someone happened to be watching. The storm did not vanish overnight. These things never do, and there remained, for a good while afterward, columnists who continued to insist on the old cruel version of events because it suited whatever narrative they had already built their careers upon. But the crowds outside her engagements grew quieter within a matter of weeks, and then, gradually, warmer, and by the time a full season had passed, I noticed something I had genuinely feared I might never see again in my remaining years of service. Ordinary people, tourists and townsfolk alike, calling out kind words to her as her car passed, the way they once had before the rumor had ever taken root at all. I never told anyone else, beyond that single private audience, about the part I had played and how it started. I do not tell you now to absolve myself of it, because I do not believe that guilt is entirely something a person gets to set down simply by explaining it to a stranger watching a video. I tell you because I think it matters that even the two people at the center of that storm, the ones who had the most cause in the world to be furious with me, chose grace over punishment, chose to trust a flawed man's genuine remorse over the easier satisfaction of holding a grudge. And I do not believe I would understand the true measure of either of their characters half so well if I had never had cause to disappoint them and watch how they responded. After that season, the remaining years of my service settled into something quieter, though I want to be careful not to give you the impression that quiet meant uneventful, because I watched a great many more small proofs of the same character pass between them right up until the week I finally hung up my uniform for good. I think, in fact, that some of the gentlest and most telling moments I ever witnessed came in those later years. Once Rowan and Alara had children of their own running through the Harrowgate gardens, because there is very little that reveals a person's true nature more completely than how they behave around small children who have no idea who they are and no reason to perform good behavior for them. I watched Morwenna become, over those later years, something the tabloids never once had a word for, because it did not fit the story they had already decided to tell about her. A genuinely doting figure to Rowan and Alara's 3 children, to Malin and Torin, and once he arrived, little Bram. She kept a drawer in her private study, I learned from one of the younger nursery staff, filled entirely with small treasures collected specifically for them. A particular kind of striped peppermint that Torin favored, a set of watercolor pencils she had noticed Malin admiring in a shop window and quietly purchased the following week, a soft toy horse for Bram that I am told he refused to sleep without for the better part of 2 years. I watched her get down onto the garden lawn in a formal gown she must have known would need cleaning afterward, without a single moment's hesitation, to help Bram search for a lost toy soldier in the flower beds, while 2 ladies-in-waiting stood by looking faintly alarmed at the state of the hem. I watched Alaric, for his part, keep a standing arrangement, never publicized, never photographed by design, of setting aside a full hour every single week, regardless of how demanding his schedule otherwise was, purely for the grandchildren, no advisors present, no agenda beyond whatever game or story they wanted that particular week. I was posted near that hour often enough over the years to know it was sacred to him in a way almost nothing else in his calendar was, and I watched him teach Torin to skip stones on the ornamental lake, watched him sit patiently through Malin's increasingly elaborate imaginary kingdoms, complete with assigned roles that more than once required a king of Eldermoor to play the part of a dragon being defeated by a 9-year-old with a wooden sword. There was a ceremony, some years into my later service, that I think captures something true about the two of them that I have not yet managed to convey to you, and I want to tell you about it before I bring this account toward its close. It was the investiture of the Cross of Valor, the kingdom's highest honor for uncommon bravery, awarded that particular year to a young soldier who had, at considerable risk to himself, pulled 3 fellow guardsmen from a collapsing structure during a training accident in the northern garrison. I was posted to the ceremonial detail that day, close enough to the dais to see both Alaric and Morwenna clearly throughout. It is customary, at such ceremonies, for the monarch alone to present the cross, with the queen consort seated a respectful distance away among the other dignitaries. But partway through the ceremony, as the young soldier's mother was brought forward to stand beside her son for the official photograph, a woman who, I learned afterward, had raised him largely alone after her husband's own death in service years before, I watched Morwenna rise from her seat, unbidden, uninstructed by any program I ever saw, and cross the dais to stand quietly beside that mother, not in the photograph itself, which she was careful to step just outside of, but close enough to take the woman's hand, the moment I saw her knees begin to buckle slightly under the weight of pride and grief mixed together, in a way that overwhelms people at moments like that. No one in the crowd, beyond the front rows, likely noticed it happen at all. It was not the kind of gesture that makes the official record, and indeed it never appeared in a single photograph of that day that I am aware of, because Morwenna had positioned herself specifically outside the frame the moment she saw the cameras aimed at the mother and son. I asked her once, much later, half joking, why she had bothered stepping outside the shot when no one would have faulted her for standing in it. She told me that the photograph was not meant to be about her, that it belonged entirely to a mother who had waited a very long time to see her son honored, and that she had only wanted to be useful to a stranger in a difficult moment, not visible for having done so. I think that answer tells you as much about her as anything else in this account. So much of what I watched her do across 23 years was built on that same instinct to help quietly from just outside the frame, and to let the credit, if there was any to be had, land anywhere but on herself. I do not think that instinct was cultivated for public relations purposes, whatever the cynics among you might assume. I watched it operate identically whether cameras were present or entirely absent, in corridors at 3 in the morning and on ceremonial dais in front of half the kingdom's press corps, and a person does not maintain that kind of consistency for 20 years purely as a performance. Performances slip, eventually, when no one is watching closely enough to reward them. Hers never did, not once, not in all the years I stood close enough to see. I should tell you, too, about how Alaric treated Morwenna's own son, Lord Cassius, because I think it reveals something about the king's character that the public rarely credits him for. Cassius was already a grown man with a household of his own by the time his mother remarried, under no obligation whatsoever to build any relationship with his mother's new husband beyond the barest formal courtesy custom required, and I would not have blamed him in the least if he had kept his distance the way a great many stepsons in his position might have. He did not. I watched Alaric over the years include Cassius in matters that had nothing to do with any formal duty at all: hunting trips, quiet dinners, long walks through the palace grounds discussing nothing more consequential than horses or old books, never pressing for closeness, never demanding gratitude for the inclusion, simply extending it steadily, year after year, the same patient, unhurried generosity I had already watched him extend to his own son Rowan on Morwenna's behalf. I heard Cassius remark once, at a family gathering I was posted to guard, that he had expected, going into his mother's second marriage, to acquire at best a polite and distant relation, and had instead, somewhat to his own surprise, acquired something closer to a second father, offered without any fanfare and never once mentioned as a favor. I think that quiet, patient generosity, extended in both directions across a blended family that could easily have splintered into rival camps, tells you as much about the marriage itself as any of the more intimate moments I have already described. A house does not hold together for 20 years on romance alone. It holds together because the people inside it keep choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to make room for each other's whole lives, children and old wounds and all. There is one further ritual of theirs I have not yet told you about, and I have saved it for near the end of this account because I think it says more plainly than anything else I witnessed exactly how far back the roots of that marriage actually reached, and how deliberately both of them tended those roots across every year I served them. Once each year, always on the same week in early summer, always with almost no advance notice given even to the household staff who had to arrange it, King Alaric and Queen Consort Morwenna traveled together, quietly and with the smallest possible security detail, back to the old countryside where they had grown up as neighbors, back to Thornwick Vale and the neighboring Rosemere estate, and to the stretch of river between them, where two young people who did not yet know what the rest of their lives held had once ridden together in the summers of their youth. I was fortunate enough to be included on that small traveling detail 3 separate times over the course of my career, and I want to tell you honestly that those were, without question, the 3 lightest weeks of duty I ever pulled in 23 years of service, not because the work was easy, but because I have never seen either of them look more unguarded, more plainly happy, than I did on the banks of that river. The old Rosemere millpond was still there, smaller than I think either of them remembered it, half overgrown at the edges, and on each of those 3 visits I watched them walk down to it together in the early evening, no attendants following, no schedule pressing, and stand at its edge for a long while, sometimes talking, sometimes simply looking at the water in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer need to fill every quiet moment with conversation to feel close to each other. On the second of those 3 visits, I watched Alaric, a king by then for a good many years, a man who had greeted foreign heads of state and addressed the assembled parliament of his own kingdom with total composure more times than I could count, roll up his trousers to the knee, wade a few unsteady steps into that shallow, muddy old millpond fully dressed otherwise, and declare, with a completely straight face, that he was simply finishing a push that had been interrupted decades earlier and was overdue for completion. Morwenna laughed so hard at the sight of him standing knee-deep in pond water in his shirt sleeves that she had to sit down on the bank, and I watched a King of Eldermoor stand there dripping and grinning like a boy of 20, waiting patiently for his wife to stop laughing long enough to help pull him back out, which she eventually did, still laughing, and still holding his hand a good while after he was safely back on dry ground. I asked once on the drive back from that 3rd visit whether the yearly trip had a name within the family, half expecting some grand romantic title befitting a king and his consort. Morwenna told me, smiling, that they simply called it going home, and that they had been doing it, in one form or another, since the very first year of their marriage, because she believed, and I have come to believe it too after everything I witnessed, that a person ought to return, at least once a year, to the ground where they first became entirely themselves, before any crown or any title or any public expectation ever had the chance to complicate it. I think that small yearly pilgrimage, more than any grander gesture either of them ever made, is the clearest proof I can offer you that whatever else that marriage was built from duty, timing, the slow mending of old wounds, 20 years of careful public discretion. It was never, at its root, anything other than 2 old friends who had fallen in love beside a muddy river a very long time ago, and who never once in all the years since stopped finding their way back to it. Which brings me back at last to that state dinner in the long gallery, 4 months before my retirement, and the foreign minister's aide with his 3 glasses of red wine, and his careless little joke about a scandal who had won. I told you at the start of this account that something in me went very cold and still when I heard it, and I want to explain, now that you have the fuller picture I have spent this account building for you, exactly why. By that point in my service I had personally witnessed, at close range, nearly everything I have just told you: the rain-soaked bench and its 6 or 7 minutes of stolen quiet, the chipped blue cup and the tea made at 3 in the morning, the pencil notes traded back and forth in the margins of an old book of poetry, the roses restored for a grieving son, the long vigil in a corridor the night the Queen Mother died, the money quietly arranged for my own father's care. The gala walked into arm in arm through a hostile crowd, the 6 weeks of manufactured scandal that I had, however unwittingly, helped set in motion, and the grace both of them had shown me when I finally confessed it. I had by then spent more of my adult life standing near that marriage than I had spent anywhere else, including my own home, and I knew with total certainty that the aide's careless little joke was not simply unkind. It was wrong, factually and completely wrong, in a way that mattered. I could not say any of that to him, of course. I was on duty, and a guard's opinion is not his to offer at a state function even when he happens to be sure of it. I stood exactly as still as my training required, gave no sign that I had heard a word, and let the evening proceed as though nothing at all had happened. But I remember walking home that night. I had a modest flat not far from the palace by then, having long since moved my family closer to my work, and sitting for a long while at my own kitchen table thinking about how strange it was that I, of all people in the kingdom, possessed a truer picture of that marriage than almost anyone else alive, and that I fully intended to carry every bit of it silently to my grave, the way a guard is trained to do, the way I had always assumed I would. It was my own wife, in fact, who first suggested otherwise, some weeks later, when I told her about the aide's remark and the anger it had stirred in me that I had no lawful way to express. She asked me reasonably what exactly I thought I was protecting by staying silent forever, now that I would soon no longer be bound by active service, now that so many of the specific private moments I had witnessed belonged to years long past rather than ongoing daily life, now that the two people at the center of them had, by every sign I could read, made a kind of peace with how the world had chosen to see them, and were unlikely to be further wounded by an old guard's fond, careful, respectful account of their marriage's quieter truths. She was right, I think, though it took me a good while longer to be sure of it, and a great deal of careful thought about exactly what was mine to share and exactly what remained theirs alone, held back out of the same discretion I had failed once badly to maintain, and had spent every year since trying to earn back. I want to be honest with you that I did eventually ask them, directly, whether I might one day tell some version of this story once my service had ended. I asked Morwenna first, actually, catching her in the same private corridor where she had once asked after my father, and I told her plainly what I had in mind. Not an exposé, not gossip, nothing that would embarrass either of them or reveal anything genuinely private that belonged to them alone, but simply an honest account, once I was free to give one, of the ordinary tenderness I had watched pass between the two of them for over 2 decades, offered in the hope that it might do some small good against a public narrative I had come to believe was deeply unfair to both of them. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she told me that she had never much cared what strangers believed about her, that she had learned, out of hard necessity, to build her peace on steadier ground than public opinion, but that she thought of the ordinary people who had shouted cruel things at her outside that hospital gala differently, not as strangers to be dismissed, but as people who had simply never been given any reason to know the truth, and who deserved, perhaps, a fairer chance to judge for themselves, if someone who actually knew the truth were ever willing to offer it. She said she trusted my judgment about what was appropriate to share and what was not, the same trust she had extended to me, I realized, from the very first Thursday morning she had walked down a corridor to ask after my father. Alaric, when I asked him separately, said much the same thing in fewer words, and added only that he hoped I would tell it plainly, without exaggeration in either direction, because he had spent enough of his life being either villainized or sanctified by people who did not know him, and would rather just once be described accurately. That is what I have tried to do tonight, as faithfully as 23 years of memory allow. My final week of active service arrived faster than I expected it to, the way the last week of anything long always seems to. There is a modest ceremony held for guards who complete a full career at Harrowgate, a formal parade dismissal, a presentation of a commemorative medal struck for long service, a handshake from whichever member of the royal household happens to preside that particular season, and then, for most guards, a quiet walkout through the same gate they first marched through decades earlier, changed a great deal on the inside and largely unremarked upon on the outside, because that is, in the end, the nature of the work. You spend a career being invisible on purpose. It should not surprise you when your leaving of it is quiet too. I expected exactly that, and I want to be honest that I had made my peace with it, because I do not believe a guard is owed fanfare simply for having done his duty for a long time, and I would have felt strange receiving any. What I did not expect, and what I have thought about nearly every day since, was what actually happened on the morning of my final parade. The ceremony itself proceeded as scheduled, in the small courtyard reserved for such occasions, with perhaps 30 people present, my own family, a handful of fellow guards near the end of their own service, the officer who had commanded my detail for the better part of a decade. I was called forward. My record was read aloud in the customary brief and formal language such records are always read in, and I received my medal from the officiating dignitary, who that year happened to be Princess Adela, standing in, as she often did, for engagements too numerous for the King and Queen Consort to attend personally. I bowed, as required, and stepped back into the small line of family and colleagues gathered to watch, and I believed entirely that the ceremony was concluded. It was not. A side door I had walked past 10,000 times in my career, one that led directly from the private household wing into that same courtyard, opened partway through the closing formalities, and King Alaric and Queen Consort Morwenna came through it together, without any advance notice on the program, without the fanfare that would ordinarily precede either of them entering any space at all. I do not believe more than a handful of people present had known they intended to come. I certainly had not. I remember my own legs going momentarily unsteady beneath me, a reaction I had never once permitted myself in 23 years of standing at attention through every kind of provocation and crisis a guard's post can present, and which I could not, in that particular moment, entirely control. They did not make a speech. That, too, surprised me, though it should not have, because so little of what mattered most in that marriage, across everything I have told you tonight, was ever announced with speeches. Alaric simply crossed the courtyard, shook my hand the way he had shaken it 100 times before at far less significant moments, and told me, quietly, that he had heard I intended, once my service concluded, to finally tell an honest account of some of what I had witnessed, and that he wanted me to know, before I did, that he trusted me to tell it well, the way he had trusted me with a great deal else over the years that mattered a good deal more than any single story. And then Morwenna stepped forward, and from a small cloth bag she had carried in herself, without any attendant to carry it for her, she produced the chipped blue teacup. I did not understand at first what I was looking at. I had seen that cup 100 times from a respectful distance in a private sitting room I had guarded but never properly entered, and I had certainly never expected to see it produced in a public courtyard at my own retirement ceremony. She told me, in front of my assembled family and colleagues, that the cup had finally, after so many decades, developed a crack too deep for even the most careful mending to hold, and that rather than let it be quietly retired to some forgotten cupboard as she had once feared it might be, she had commissioned a craftsman to seal the crack permanently in fine gold lacquer, in the old style, the kind of repair that does not hide a flaw but honors it. Makes the break itself part of the object's beauty rather than something to be ashamed of. She said she had decided, once she and the king learned what I intended to do with my retirement, that the cup ought to go to the one man outside their own family who had watched it used for its true purpose more faithfully and for longer than almost anyone else alive, and she placed it directly into my hands. I did not manage in that moment to say anything remotely adequate in response. I do not believe I said much of anything at all beyond a badly cracked thank you of my own. My wife told me afterward that I stood entirely still for a long moment, the old habit of 23 years asserting itself even in a moment that called for something else entirely, before I finally managed to bow, properly, the way I had bowed to them 1,000 times before, except that this time, for the first and only time in my career, King Alaric would not let the bow stand uncorrected. He caught my shoulder before I had gone halfway down and pulled me instead into an embrace, brief and entirely unceremonial, the kind of thing I had watched him give his own son on the rare occasions when words were not sufficient, and told me, near my ear, so quietly that I do not believe anyone else in that courtyard heard it, that I had guarded far more than his person over the years, and that he would not soon forget it. I still have the cup. It sits now on a shelf in my own small sitting room, in the modest house where I have spent these first months of retirement learning slowly what it is to no longer stand watch over anyone. I have not used it for tea myself, and I do not think I ever will, because it does not feel like an object meant for ordinary use anymore, not to me. It feels instead like the clearest single piece of evidence I possess for everything I have told you tonight. A plain, imperfect, deliberately mended thing, kept for decades not because it was valuable in any way the world would recognize, but because it mattered to the people who loved it, cracks and all, more than anything gleaming and unbroken ever could have. I have had these last months of retirement to think about why a marriage like theirs gets so consistently misread by people who have never come within 100 yards of it, and I do not think the answer is complicated, even if the marriage itself was. People are handed from the outside only the smallest fragments of any royal life, a photograph taken from too far away to show a face clearly, a formal appearance where the requirements of ceremony demand a stillness that can look, to an untrained eye, indistinguishable from coldness, a headline written by someone with every incentive to make the story more dramatic than the truth ever was. From fragments like that, a public builds its own version of events, and once that version takes hold, it tends to calcify, because most people, understandably, do not have the time or the access to go looking for a fuller picture. They take what they are given and move on with their lives, and I do not think there is anything foolish or unkind in that. It is simply how public perception of any life lived partly in the open tends to form. What I had, and what almost no one else outside their own family ever had, was 23 years of the fragments the public never saw at all, the parts that happened before the cameras arrived each morning and after they were dismissed each evening, the parts that happened in corridors and gardens and small sitting rooms where a guard's presence was so routine as to become nearly invisible even to the two people he was protecting. I do not say this to claim some special virtue for myself. I say it because I think it explains, as plainly as I know how, why my account of that marriage differs so completely from the one most of you have absorbed without ever quite choosing to. I was simply standing in a different place than everyone else who ever wrote or spoke about them, and what I saw from that place was not a calculated political arrangement dressed up in royal finery, and was not either some grand sweeping romance out of an old ballad, all size and destiny. It was smaller than either of those stories, and truer, and I think in the end, more moving than both of them combined, two people, imperfect and late and careful with each other precisely, because they understood what carelessness had already cost, choosing each other quietly, every single ordinary day, for 20 years, in ways so small that almost no one but a guard standing post in the right hallway would ever have reason to notice them at all. I think, too, about how much of what I watched them build together was constructed directly out of the wreckage of what the public had already decided about them before either of them had any real chance to prove otherwise. Most married couples get to build their private language, their inside jokes, their small rituals, without an audience deciding in advance what those things must secretly mean. Alaric and Morwenna did not have that luxury. Every kindness either of them showed the other for years could be, and often was read by someone somewhere, as evidence for whatever unflattering theory that particular observer had already settled on. I think it says something remarkable about both of them that they kept building the marriage anyway, kept leaving each other notes in the margins of an old book, kept sitting on a rain-soaked bench every morning they possibly could, kept choosing, over and over, ordinary tenderness over public performance, even knowing that the ordinary tenderness would almost certainly never be believed by the people who most needed to see it. I do not know whether one retired guard's account, offered honestly and imperfectly on an evening like this one, can meaningfully shift a public perception that took decades to calcify in the first place. I am not naive enough to think a single video changes what a whole kingdom has decided to believe about two people it has mostly only ever seen from 200 yards away through a long lens. But I think of that dying child in the Eastern Hospital ward, asking Morwenna directly, without any of the caution adults have learned to perform, whether the newspapers were telling the truth, and I think of how completely her honest, unguarded answer moved people who had spent weeks shouting cruelty at her from behind a barricade. I think there is something in most people, even people who have been persuaded for years by an unkind and inaccurate story, that responds to the truth when it is finally offered to them plainly and without exaggeration. I have chosen to believe that at least because the alternative, that people would rather keep an interesting cruel story than accept a quieter kind one, is a belief about human nature I am not yet willing to hold, not after everything I watched pass between those two people for 23 years. There is one last memory I want to leave you with, because I think it draws together everything else I have told you tonight more completely than any single anecdote could on its own. It comes from the day of Alaric's coronation, some years into my service, the single most solemn and heavily documented occasion either of them ever passed through in public. Thousands gathered outside the cathedral, the ceremony itself broadcast to every corner of the kingdom, every gesture rehearsed for weeks in advance to guarantee that nothing on that day would appear anything less than perfectly composed. I was posted that morning to the small robing chamber where the king prepared before the ceremony began, a narrow stone room just off the cathedral's north transept, close enough to hear everything that passed inside it while remaining, as always, entirely unremarked upon. Alaric was nervous that morning in a way I had rarely seen him nervous before, understandably so, given the weight of what he was about to formally accept, and I watched the attendants fuss over the ceremonial robes and the ancient regalia with the particular tense precision that surrounds occasions where a single misplaced clasp will be noted by half the kingdom's press corps. Morwenna came in only briefly, a few minutes before the procession was due to begin, already dressed for her own place in the ceremony, and I watched every attendant in that room instinctively step back to give her room, the way people who have worked in a household long enough learn to step back from a moment that plainly does not belong to them. She did not say anything grand. She did not offer him some rehearsed word of encouragement fit for the historical record. She simply straightened the heavy ceremonial collar at his shoulders, which did not, so far as I could tell, actually need straightening, and told him, quietly enough that I nearly missed it entirely over the murmur of the attendants, that whatever crown they placed on his head in the next hour, she had already known for a very long time what kind of man was underneath it, and that nothing about to happen in that cathedral was going to change what she already knew. He did not answer her with words. He took her hand for a moment, the same unhurried, unself-conscious gesture I had watched him make on a rain-soaked garden bench 100 times before. And then the attendants swept back in, and the procession began. And within the hour I watched him walk down that cathedral aisle in front of the assembled might and history of the entire kingdom, with a composure so complete that not a single person in that vast crowd, watching through binoculars or television screens or the long lenses of 100 cameras, could possibly have guessed that the steadiest thing about him in that moment was not the crown being lowered onto his head, but the quiet certainty, given to him minutes earlier by the woman waiting near the transept door, that he was already, and had long since been, exactly enough. That is the last thing I wanted you to see, because I think it captures, better than any other single memory from 23 years of service, the actual architecture of what I watched grow between them. Not grand declarations, not a fairy tale performed for an audience, a woman straightening a collar that did not need straightening, and a king walking into the most consequential hour of his public life, steadied by nothing more dramatic than the certainty of being known. I am aware, sitting here now, months into a retirement I am still learning the shape of, that some of you listening will not be moved by any of this, and I have made a kind of peace with that too. There are people who have decided, for reasons that belong entirely to their own lives and their own histories, that a story about a powerful man and the woman once called a scandal cannot possibly be a story about ordinary devotion, and no account from a retired guard, however honest, is likely to unseat a belief that firmly rooted. I did not write this for those people, exactly, though I would not mind if it reached them. I wrote it, if I am honest with myself, for the ones somewhere in between, the ones who half suspect the public story might be thinner than it looks, who have wondered, at some point, whether two people who have now spent decades together might actually like each other, might actually have built something real in all that time, rather than merely tolerated each other for the sake of appearances and a crown. If that is you, I hope what I have told you tonight has been useful. I have tried, as carefully as I know how, to give you nothing but what I actually saw. I think often, these days, about how differently I might have judged that marriage myself if I had only ever seen what the rest of the kingdom saw, the careful photographs, the formal appearances, the handful of controversies that made the newspapers because controversy sells papers and quiet contentment does not. I would very likely have believed some version of what that aide believed, standing at his dinner table with his wine and his careless little joke, because I would have had no reason to believe otherwise. It was only the accident of my own career, the particular corridors I happened to be posted to over so many years, that gave me a fuller picture, and I do not think that accident makes me wiser than anyone else who has only ever seen the fragments. It makes me luckier. I got to watch, at close range and for a very long time, what an actual marriage looks like when it is built quietly, deliberately, and honestly by two people who have already made every mistake they intend to make, and have decided, from that point forward, to be gentle with each other for as long as they are given. I do not know what the years ahead hold for either of them, though I hope, selfishly, for a great deal more of the same quiet, ordinary tenderness I spent 2 decades watching, more mornings on the rain-soaked bench, more tea made at 3 in the morning in a cup mended now in gold, more notes left in the margins of an old book neither of them will ever finish annotating, because I suspect, knowing them both as well as I have come to, that they never actually want to run out of things to say to each other in pencil. I do know that whatever the newspapers choose to write about them in the years I am no longer there to see it firsthand, I will carry my own account of them with me for the rest of my life, and I am glad, finally, after a long career built on discretion and silence, to have found a way to set at least part of it down. If you take only one thing from everything I have told you tonight, let it be this. The people we watch from a great distance are never quite the people we imagine them to be, not because the distance shows us something false exactly, but because it shows us so little that our own imagination is forced to fill in the rest. And imagination, left to its own devices, tends to reach for drama rather than for truth, because drama is more interesting to believe. I stood close enough for 23 years to see past that distance, and what I found there was not drama at all. It was two people, older and more careful than they had been at 20, choosing each other quietly every single day, in 100 small, unwitnessed ways, for far longer than most marriages the world calls happy ever managed to sustain. I do not know a better definition of love than that. I certainly never found one, in all my years of standing guard over it. Thank you for listening to an old guardsman's account. It is the last thing I intend to tell anyone about the two people I spent my career protecting, and I have told it at last, exactly as I promised them I would, plainly, and without exaggeration in either direction. I hope it changes, even a little, how you see them. I know it changed how I saw everything.